Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. So we're back in the hands-on lab, and we are at exercise number 3, Customize the UI. And if we take a look at the first task, it's entitled Modifying the Start Page, and it considers the start page to be the groupItems.html page. So just to be clear on what we're talking about here, this exercise will ask us to make some modifications to this grouped items page. We have groupings of individual items, and as we can see, first of all, each grouping has the title and this little arrow next to it, and then each of the individual items has an image with a little overlay, and on top of the overlay we see the name of the recipe, and then something that unfortunately is undefined, and that's something we will make a change to during the course of this exercise. We're not binding to the correct data inside of our items that's coming from the recipes.txt file. All right. So at any rate, we could follow the instructions and just jump right in and start making changes. But I think it would be more helpful if we step back for a moment and get a larger picture of what's really going on here. Exercise 3 seeks to change how recipe groups and items are rendered on that page. So let's make sure we understand how they're rendered now before we begin making changes. As we learned a while ago, the ListView control, which is what that page utilizes, it's from the Win.js library. It manages how data is bound to a series of templates. Exactly how that works is really the crux of this lesson. So if we take a look at the groupItems.html page, we see that there are two main divisions inside of the body. The first division from line 18 to 34 is a series of templates. There's a header template and an item template. And at a high level, the header template will display the group name and the little arrow, and then the item template will be for each of the individual large squares that contain the image of the recipe, and then that little overlay area where we have the title of the recipe and that what currently is undefined. All right, we'll get back to this in just a moment. Then the second portion of the body is devoted to the actual layout of the page, and it's in that layout that we find this div, which will, if we scroll over to the right, will be utilized. So we see this data win control. It'll be transformed into a list view. All right. Now we would expect in the data win options to see this list view somehow wired up to these templates so that it can stamp those out as needed. But we're going to see that that's set in JavaScript instead of through the data win options attribute. All right, so we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's start back up in our templates here near the top, and let's tackle this header template for just a moment. It's probably some of the more complex code that we're going to see in our application. Now remember that we're talking about the little group name like Chinese, French, Italian. That's what this is rendering out, and it's rendered as a button, and the text that we see is actually contained in these two spans. So this first span will data win bind the text content of this span to the title property of our individual recipe items. And then we see that there's this class group-chevron, which is simply, if we looked it up in the CSS, it's just going to give us that little arrow to the right of the group name. What's a little bit more challenging is this large expression here. If we take a look at two pieces of it. First of all, we have a data win bind group key to key, and then below that we have this button. This on click. And it's to application.navigator.pagecontrol.navigate to group, passing in event.sourceElement.groupKey. All right, so how does all this work? Well, so we learn here, first of all, that each of the group headers in our grouped items pages are button elements. Each button contains two spans. We've already talked about that. The button has that data win bind set so that when the user clicks the group header, the key is passed into the on-click event handler. This extra key information is used to navigate to the right group for the group detail page, and we'll get to that in just a moment, how we figure that out. And the on-click event calls this navigate to group. So if we were to just do a Control F and have that highlighted, let's see throughout our project where navigate to group is located. And so I can quickly see that on the groupeditems.js page, there's a definition for this method, navigate to group, and it basically wraps around this nav.navigate method. And we can see that nav is just an alias for winjs.navigation. So we would expect to see a winjs.navigation.navigate function that accepts the page we want to navigate to and some extra information. In this case, the key. So I'm assuming here, just thinking out loud, that the group detail.js file will need that key in order to access the correct group that was clicked on the grouped items page. So when you click on Chinese, it should go to the group detail page and bring up the information about China, and it's the right picture and the right descriptive paragraph and so on. We'll come back to this in just a moment as we begin to wrap things and tie things up nicely. More curiously, what is all of this mess preceding that call to navigate to group? And so I think that we can kind of pick this apart. If we were to look for where application is actually defined, and I happen to know it's in one of the current open documents that I have, so let's just do that. Let's find where it's at. Okay, here we go. So we can see in the navigator.js file where the namespace application's been defined. Great. And if we look back here, it's application.navigator. So if we look again in the navigator.js and just scroll down a little bit, here there is this page control navigator class that's being defined. Inside of its constructor for the class, you can see where we're tacking on a navigator property at runtime and setting it equal to this. And this represents the class, the context inside of which. So we're really just getting a reference here. When we talk about application.navigator, we're talking about this class, all right, this page control navigator. And part of page control navigator, it defines a property called page control, which is the next part of this equation. And page control, if you just looked at the text above it, this is the currently loaded page object. So really, when we're looking at all of this right here, this is just a way to make sure that we're calling the navigate to group function in the correct JS file. In this case, it would be the correct file would be the groupeditems.js page, which indeed has its navigate to group, as opposed to the navigate to group function that might be defined in one of these other pages, .js. Okay. All right, so just wanted to kind of break that apart and walk through how we can dissect these things and figure out what belongs to what and how it all works together. All right, so back on the groupeditems.html page, we see that whenever somebody clicks the button that says Chinese or French or Italian or whatever the case might be, we're going to call this navigate to group, and navigate to group, again, is a wrapper around the winjs.navigation.navigate method. We'll get to that a little bit later. We're relying on that group key to be passed in so that we navigate to the correct group detail page. And so that's where this data win bind group key : key comes into play. So I guess the first question is, how does this get bound, and where is the data source set for this page? I mean, how does this data win bind actually know where to pull its data from? Well, let's take a look at the groupeditems.js page and scroll down to line number 57. If you recall from earlier when we were looking at this, the initialized layout sets the item data source and the group data source to our data.js file where we have the individual recipe items and the groups, which was a projection on top of that items collection. Just to refresh your memory from a couple of videos ago, do you remember all of this and where we added this? That's what we're talking about here, okay? So back in initialize layout. We know this gets executed as soon as this grouped items page is loaded, because it's called here whenever the ready event is fired, which as we noted earlier, that this is called whenever a user navigates to the page, it populates the page elements with the app's data, and the ready event is like the last event that gets fired before the user can then take control of the app. So we know that initialize layout gets called, and that's where everything gets bound up. All right. But that doesn't answer the question of what does this group key refer to? Well, if we take a look at, we know it's pulling its data from the recipes.txt file, right? So let's open this up a little bit larger. We can see that groups, that has a group object that it's bound to, and that it has a key, and that key is either set to Chinese, or if we were to scroll down, look at other examples, there'd be French, Italian, and so on. All right, so what we would expect to be bound to here, this data when bind would either be Chinese or French or Italian or whatever. So that's ultimately what gets passed into navigate to group, the word Chinese or French or Italian or German or whatever the case might be. Okay. All right, so back to the grouped items.js, just one more time, want to drive that home. That's what gets passed into our navigate function, where we're navigating to group detail, passing now in the word Chinese or French or Italian or whatever the case might be. All right, so let's go ahead and finally talk about that. I already said that we know this navigate method belongs to WinJS.navigation. And if we were to look this up in the MSDN help, we would realize that obviously the first parameter that we're sending in is the URL to navigate to, and the second part, and the important part for our discussion, is that it's set to the initial state, which can be accessed later in our JavaScript whenever loading this page. So the initial state is passed through to the next page fragment that's loaded into the default.html. So if you look at the group details, let's load that up. All right, so we're going from grouped items to the group detail. In the group detail.js page, the JavaScript file that's associated with the group detail.html page. And if we scroll down to the ready event handler for the page, the options part that gets passed into it is going to be that word Chinese or French or Italian or German or whatever the case might be. And you can see how it's used first in line number 15. So we want to get a reference to that group, to the actual group object from our recipe.txt in our data folder. And so we want to make sure that options is not empty. And if so, then we're going to grab out, we're going to evaluate the group key. And if the group key does indeed exist, which we would expect it always to, then we're going to call that helper method. We didn't really talk about those 4 or 5 helper methods in the data namespace, but now we're going to call resolve group reference and pass in that options.group key, the word Chinese or French or Italian, German, whatever the case might be. And that resolve group reference, if we take a look at data.js and scroll down, resolve group reference, you pass in a key, and it's going to look through all the groups and find the key, find the particular group that you're interested in. So as the function says, get the unique group corresponding to the provided group key. Great. So now that we have the group, what are we going to do with it? Well, you can see the very next thing is that we're going to get all of the items that belong to that group. And then we're going to start by turning around and creating a create grouped. Remember that from a long time ago? It's a projection on top of the list that will give us, that projection gives us all the items for a given group. And then we'll use that and set the ListView's item data source. Here's where we set the ListView's item template. And again, we're in the wrong file to talk about this, but you can see how this is set to the item template, and the group header template is set to the element.querySelector. It finds that header template div and so on, and actually binds the ListView on the group detail page to the group in the items. Okay, so that makes sense. And just out of curiosity, let's pop back then to the grouped items.js, and there's something almost identical here. We're not actually getting an individual item or group because we're dealing with the whole collection of data, but you can see what I really wanted to point out here is how we get a reference to the list view by using element.querySelector and then using the class name grouped items list, and then we're setting its group header template and its item template. And so here's the header template and the item template, and that's how we set which templates will be used for our grouped items list. Okay, all right, so kind of went off on a tangent there when we started with the header template, but the second template is the item template, and this is for the recipe items, each of the individual recipe items that display beneath the group header. And we can see what's being bound here for every item in the list. There is an image, which is, you can see we're getting two values. We're setting the source attribute of the image to the background image that's defined in the recipes.txt file, and then the alt value of the image will be set to the actual title of each recipe item. And then there's this overlay. Recall that we talked about this little transparent overlay that sits over the image, and on top of that is text, which is defined with an H4 and an H6 respectively. The H4 has the title, and then the H6 has the subtitle, and that's why we're seeing the word undefined, because recipes.txt does not have the notion of a subtitle anywhere here. It just has title, and let's see if we can find that other one, right? Was it tile image? What were we looking at there? Background image. All right, so yeah, background image is the very first property of each object. And so in this first item's case, it's using that Chinese _1_600_C. So when we run it, that image is right there. Okay, and here's the text from it, and then obviously the undefined portion of it. Okay, makes sense. So let's close that down. All right, so based on what we saw a few moments ago from the groupdetail.js file, what would you expect to see in the groupeditems.js file? I would expect to see, like we already pointed out, a ready event handler that knows how to grab a list of recipe groups and items and then kick off the binding of these templates to instances of the data for each group and item. And that's what we see in lines 18 through 37 here. And first, we see, again, just to point this out, that we are getting an instance of the list view so that we can work with it programmatically. And this query selector is part of the W3C selector API. So we're saying get the element whose class is grouped items list, and then get the WinJS control that's hosted by this element. We would expect this to be a list view control, obviously. And now in our JavaScript, we have a reference to that WinJS control. So this onItemInvoked event will fire when somebody clicks on an individual recipe item. And this item of invoked function is defined way down here in line number 71 at the bottom of the file. And it takes an argument. And that argument is going to be which item was clicked on. Now, we're not ready to talk about the view states just yet. So ignore this app view state snapped. We'll just look at this case for now, this else case. And so whenever an item is clicked, we want to grab a item. So we're going to call the data.items. What is that going to give us? It gives us the reference to the entire list of items. That list has a getAt function that I just briefly brushed by when we looked at all of the functions that are built into lists, to WinJS lists. And we're going to give it the index of the item that we want to pull out. So args.detail.itemindex, all right? And then we're going to call the WinJS.navigation.navigate, and then pass that item, and in order to get at the item, we'll call one more helper method in our data.js, this get item reference right here. So we get a reference for an item using the group key and the item title as a unique reference to the item that can be easily serialized. So we're just getting at one item, and we're going to then pass that to the item detail dot HTML page, which will pass this value to the item detail.js. Okay. All right. One little interesting tidbit of information. In line number 26, you can see this add event listener is listening for the key down event. So what I think this is interesting. Set up a keyboard shortcut, Control-Alt-G, to navigate to the current group when not in snapped mode. So we'll talk about snap mode later. Let's not worry about that. But just whenever a user uses the shortcut Control-Alt-G combination, we call this navigate to group method, which performs a navigate. So we're back here, navigate to the group detail.html page with the selected key. So I tell you what, let's try this out here just for fun. So I'm hitting Control-Alt-G on my keyboard, and I go to the first item in the first group in our list. So it's interesting how they were able to enable keyboard shortcuts in this manner. Let's go ahead and stop that. In addition to the navigate to group, immediately after that, there's these two curious lines of code. So there are some event args that are passed in, or event arguments. So this first one, e.prevent default, applies to the e, which is the argument passed into this anonymous function. We're saying whatever the default system-wide action this keyboard combination might do, don't do it. In our app, we're going to be handling this keyboard combination ourselves. And so we're saying prevent the default mapping of this Control, Alt, and G from happening. And then furthermore, in the next line of code, stop immediate propagation method. It prevents the keyboard combination from being sent onto Windows or other apps that after we've handled it. We've already taken care of it. You don't need to pass it or let it bubble up and let anybody else look at it. Okay, so this is, don't use whatever the default command is, and don't bubble that command back up to any other apps like Windows. All right. So back to the big picture before we conclude this lesson. We wanted to better understand how the binding of our Win.js list view works before we start modifying it in our app. We learned how the list view control is set up with a data source for both groups and items, and then it consults the data-when-bind property to set the binding from an attribute of an element to a property of our data source. We saw how clicks from a group title or item image can be set to navigate to the appropriate page control, the page fragment, sending in the key for the respective group or item, so that the right group or item is loaded into the page that we're navigating to. And finally, we saw how we were able to bind a keyboard combination to a command to navigate to another page fragment, and how the app overrides the same keyboard combination that might be used in Windows or other apps, as well as preventing it from propagating up to Windows. Cool. Okay, so that gives us the background information, a little bit of confidence to go in and start making changes to the actual UI now, since we know how it's all wired up. And we'll begin doing that in the next lesson. Thank you.